Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to the second week in January, and welcome to Myth and Magic, the Fantasy Fiction Writers podcast. This week I'm going to look at the second part of your New Year's resolutions, and I'm going to be talking about sacrifice and why it's good for you. I'm also going to look at magical thinking and discuss magical thinking and talk about why we're all elders now. But first, I wanted to ask you a question. Who is January? Well, in ancient Roman religion, Janus was the god of beginnings and of gates and of transitions, of time, of duality and of endings. So as a writer of fantasy fiction, maybe he should be your mythical go-to deity, because Janus exemplifies liminality, and liminality is a vital hallmark of any fantasy fiction project. Now, if you don't know what liminality is, I discussed it in episode 13 and I expanded on it in episode 51. Both of those podcasts are available. And I evaluate it in some detail in my non-fiction manual for fantasy fiction writers, and the manual is called So You Want to Write Fantasy. But as the god of transitions, Janus had functions related to birth and to travel and exchange, and he presided over the beginning and the end of conflicts, hence war and peace. And this is why perhaps we associate him with the first month of the year, although some scholars believe that the month of January is probably more likely named after Juno, who is the goddess of birth. And we do know that the calends, which is the beginning of the month, are under Juno's jurisdiction. Anyway, unusually for a classical deity, the Greeks do not have an analogous god to Janus, so it seems that Janus is a completely Roman conception. As the god of movement, Janus watches over the passages. So, like I say, he's a very useful god to have on hand if you're a fantasy fiction author. And he also makes the actions begin because he's the god of movement, in Latin, principium. And he presides over all beginnings. Janus has a double nature, and this is symbolised in art as an image with two heads. He's linked with gates. The gates of a building in Rome that bear his name, which is not actually a temple, by the way, but is often called the Temple of Janus, is an open enclosure with doors at each end, the gates of Janus. And these were opened in wartime, and they were closed on the occasions of the arrival of peace during the Roman civilization. But that link with gates means that he is curiously linked to the much younger Christian figure of St. Peter. In fact, Janus was already known as Pater, or the Holy Father, in the city of Rome long before Peter arrived there. And you'll know, I'm sure, that according to Christian tradition, St. Peter, who was not only the first pope, also holds the keys to heaven. And that makes St. Peter, therefore, an emblem of liminality too. But going back to Janus, due to his association with the beginnings, then every morning belongs to Janus. The Roman lyrical poet Horace called Janus the morning father, matutin pater. Romans believe that the winter solstice occurred on December the 25th, and on January the 1st a new year began. Romans also believe that the beginning of anything was an omen for everything that followed it. Thus, on the first day of the year, it was customary to exchange cheerful words and good wishes, and we continue that process now. I've said before in previous podcasts that we're still Romans. We're still part of the Roman civilization because so many things that we do come from that period. I just want to finish talking about Janus with something called craniofacial duplication. Craniofacial duplication. Now, although this is extremely rare, and you're going to say, what's this got to do with Janus, the god of January? I will tell you. Although it's extremely rare, it is occasionally seen in animals, and it's a condition where a creature is born with two faces. Now, the condition is not the same as conjoined twins, because it's not due to the incomplete fusion or separation of two embryos, but rather it's the result of activity that's abnormal in a protein during embryonic development. And that abnormal protein has created a two-faced animal at birth. We also call this dysprosia, and most dysprosic animals are stillborn, but some are able to live for a very short while afterwards. Humans very, very rarely survive much longer than minutes. But cats born with the condition are often able to live longer. And there was a cat named Frankenlouis who was two-faced, and he lived for 15 years. Now this cat, Frankenlouis, was born with one brain, but he had two faces, which means he had two mouths, they both functioned, two noses, they both functioned, and three blue eyes, although the central eye did not work. In answer to who is January the god of beginnings? What is sacrifice and why is it good for you? This is the second part of my New Year's resolutions. There's going to be a third part next week. But this is about sacrifice. Now, we have so much, don't we? We have abundant fruits. We have enough bread, or more than enough bread to eat. We have more water than we can ever drink. We have more time than we can ever use. And we have a host of other chattels. But what if we were down to our last crust? What if we were down to our last cup of water? Would we have the compassion and the selflessness to share it with another? And what if that other was not even one of our own, but an unseen stranger? Most of us are caught in a race for success, and we like to collect as many playing counters as we can in this thing that we call the game of life. The word sacrifice sounds religious, and that's because it comes from the Latin sacrificium, which means performing priestly functions, and because religious types bang on about sacrifice all the time. But don't let the word put you off. If you think about it as forfeiture, then it will help you understand it. It's about forfeiture which overcomes weakness. It's about forfeiture which allows you to summon courage. And it's about forfeiture which allows you to build a deep awareness for others. According to the Old English proverb, the measure of sacrifice is the measure of love. And this makes perfect sense. We know, for example, that a mother sacrifices her sleep and her career and her meals and her hobbies and even her body for her child. But a mother's most valuable sacrifice, and the one that she finds most painful to give, is the sacrifice of letting go. She must allow her child to go free, to be independent of her influence, even when she knows that her child might be in danger when she lets go. This is what we call letting go of the apron strings. And it's the sacrifice of release. And your written work as a fantasy fiction writer is similar. It must also be released. Even though you might have used up all your love to make it happen, and you might be scared to let it go, it must be released into the world. That's your sacrifice. The final sacrifice that you make is allowing your written work to fly free and unprotected into the bad world. Now, I suspect you might have sacrificed enough already. For example, you might already do an unpleasant job to keep the roof over your head. You might go without holidays, perhaps. either to look after your family or to look after sick relatives. You might forego a nice lay-in the weekend to write the next chapter of your novel. So clearly, you must agree that sacrifice is about giving. Yes, it's often about giving to others, but it's also about giving to yourself. We don't think about this as much as we should do. Very often, sacrifice is about self-reliance. The last one that I mentioned just then, getting up early to write a chapter of your book, is actually the sacrifice of incremental transaction. And what I mean by that is you don't run a marathon on day one. You start with a little jog, maybe half a mile. And you might work on a second job because if you do, you can eventually afford to buy your own home. But these things take time, and that's why they're incremental. And being an author takes time. It requires a lot of early starts. It requires a lot of transactional sacrifices. You sacrifice your time now, your time spent perhaps watching telly on the Netflix, or your time spent playing a video game, or even your time with friends to write another chapter. Because we sacrifice bread now for better quality or more bread tomorrow. It makes perfect sense to be strict with yourself, and strictness involves sacrifice. I suppose that if you dedicate your life to helping everybody around you and uplifting the whole world, then you will be blessed. But being saintly takes great sacrifice and enormous discipline, and it will probably mean that you will not have time to be a writer. So instead of that, think of writing as helping your fellow man. Think of writing as a chance to encourage others. Think of writing as a chance to facilitate. Think of writing as your contribution to a better and more loving world. Think of writing as all these things rather than thinking it as a thing to win or to push or to leverage or to grasp or to pursue a dream. If you do these things, then I think you'll be on the path to righteousness. And sacrifice typically means giving something up. And we know that in the new year, we often resolve to give something up. And the thing you give up should be of value. Often, it's giving up yourself is the sacrifice. The more valuable the thing is, and the more potent the thing is, then the better your sacrifice will be. And I would like to ask you what you have given up to be a better writer and what you'd be willing to give up in 2021. For example, will you give up your time to be a better writer? Will you give up some lay-ins to be a better writer? Will you give up perhaps a hobby to be a better writer? Will you give up drinks with friends, or sports and pastimes, or your computer games, or a Netflix box set? Will you give up idling your time away to be a better writer? And finally, I want to make one last suggestion, and it's to do with sacrifice. Put your readers first, because that's how you show your love of writing and your love of fellows. And that is your ultimate sacrifice. Put your readers first. What is magical thinking, and how to illustrate magical thinking in your fiction? Magical thinking is the belief that events are connected to each other even though there is no plausible link between them, except for some kind of curious and inexplicable supernatural phenomenon. Magical thinking is also known as superstitious thinking. Although most theorists think that magical thinking is irrational, the belief that one's thoughts by themselves can produce effects in the outside world, or that a thought on its own can somehow correspond to something else, which is usually bad, by the way, or that a thought on its own can influence what might happen, these are all powerful and quite compelling assumptions that most of us have at least some of the time, and most of us have at least sometimes succumbed to. So, for example, if you've ever said, "I don't want to tempt fate," before you're just about to say something, or you've flicked a coin into a wishing well, or you've used a euphemism for death to avoid conjuring it up, or you've knocked on wood after you've made a favourable prediction, then you are guilty, like all of us, of magical thinking. So don't think that magical thinking is just a psychiatric illness. It happens to all of us, but some people are persuaded by it more than others. So lines like "I don't want to tempt fate" and "touching wood" are mystical phrases, and we use them all of the time. And I think there's a reason for that. I think that it's because deep down we're still clinging on to our 4-year-old selves. We still hold on to a time in our life when we used make-believe and we used fantasy to help us understand very tricky ideas or very difficult situations. And that's why we still believe in magic. Like, for example, the magic of special places, churches, or old stones, or graveyards. And we believe in the magic of people, like, for example, priests and ventriloquists and mentalists, and even aromatherapists. And we believe in the magic of coincidence, and this is like thinking about somebody and then they call us, thinking about somebody and they turn the corner. And we believe in the magic of serendipity, and this is about solving problems by what's called lateral thinking, which is really just a pseudoscience. And we believe in the magic of good fortune, like if you blow on a dice, then the number you wish for will roll. It seems we love to wander through our world as our kindergarten selves, with an open mind to magical thinking, and with the same willingness to believe in a mystical and a mythical world, the same willingness we had when we were children. Now, if you want to introduce an element of magical thinking into your writing, I suggest that you blur the boundaries of magic and science and religion in your story. So, for example, if you're describing something technical, then give the object you're describing a dash of sentience. And if you're describing something magical, then make it sound plausibly mechanical. And if you're describing something spiritual, then make it sound pragmatic and make it sound tangible. And then once all these boundaries are blurred in your story, you'll find that anything can happen to your characters and to your plot. When using elements of magical thinking in your fiction, I urge you to try to describe a character's sense of joy and of loss. A joy when magical thinking comes true, and loss when magical thinking does not come true. And also do your best to describe a person's struggles with life without magical thinking, and then how they deal with the challenges that life presents with magical thinking. Consider and explore the argument that if a person believes in something strongly enough, then it will happen, and use that as a plot motivator. And also try to use lots of symbolism in your work, because symbolism is part and parcel of magical thinking, and try to use imagery. So the knock on wood is a type of mental image, and try to use ingenious metaphors to get across the blurred nature between what is real and what is unreal. So good luck with your magical thinking. Let me know how you get on with it. And please share your thoughts on Twitter at Neilmach, Neilmach, all one word. Good luck. We are all elderish now. Imagine being trapped inside home, or inside a room, inside a box. Imagine being trapped every day and afraid of stepping out into the world because the world is becoming progressively too difficult to understand. Imagine being isolated from all your loved ones, with no visits from them, no hugs, no sympathy, no smiles. Imagine feeling apprehensive about the future, alarmed about the present, and longing for the past. Can you imagine all those things? Yes, of course you can, because you're going through those things right now. Now, they say that before you judge a man, you must walk a mile in his shoes. Well, I say, before you judge an old person, sit for an hour in her slippers. Because we are all old now. We can finally understand what it's like to be old and to be alone and to be scared and to be on the brink of ruin. And yeah, it's not nice, is it? We're all elderish now. Normally, and fortunately, we don't need to share an emotional experience to feel empathy for somebody's situation. Normally, we use mental images to draw some solid conclusions, and that helps us empathise. But this pandemic has illustrated very clearly to us all what it's like to be elderly. And I'll give you some suggestions, because if you're anything like me, then you will probably be currently sheltered, hiding at home, hunkered down, apprehensive to go out. Like me, you possibly will be lacking firmness of character and of purpose. You'll be feeling weak and feeble. You'll perhaps lack physical strength and certainly lack vitality. You're becoming poor enough that eventually you'll need some help from others to keep going. And you're starting to feel frightened by the unremittingly bad news. And you're also feeling increasingly confused about the state of this world. Now, if you described any of those things a year and a half ago, people would say, are you an old person? But everybody is experiencing at least some of those things now. And of course, many of us are unemployed and uninsured, a bit like an older person. Some are convalescing, like an older person. Many are vulnerable, like an older person. Some of us, we admit, are going a bit dotty, like an older person. Plenty of us are not being provided with adequate nourishment, like an older person. Some feel penniless, like an older person. Many feel grumpy, like an older person. Many feel distracted, like an older person. Many of us feel lonely, like an older person. And a large part of us are not salaried. And basically, we're ailing. So I'd like you to think about becoming elderish, because that's what you are, and try to be empathetic with everybody around you, not just the elderly, but everybody. Because now is the time not to judge. Instead, now is the time to be sensitive and aware. Now is the time to acknowledge that others too are suffering like us. Now is the time to be open and honest and kind on social media. Now is the time to be patient with others. Now is the time to listen. Now is the time to understand and share concerns. And now is the time to create kindness instead of intolerance. Let me know how you get on. Let me know how you feel. Do you feel elderish? Tweet me at Neil Mack, Neilmach, all one word. Next week I'm going to do the last part of the New Year's resolutions, and we'll talk about some other myth and magic themes. Good luck with your writing, and let me know how you're getting on. Best wishes.